Hi, I'm Cassandra Reynolds. 6 months ago, I watched my father shake hands with FBI Agent Thompson, while my mother handed over a manila folder thick with fabricated evidence. They were destroying my security clearance, my career, and my entire future. The worst part? They smiled while doing it. But last week, I received keys to the Pioneer Federal Building in downtown Portland, the same building where that agent works. You see, my parents never knew about Aunt Lillian's little secret. They never knew she owned the very ground their lives were built on. So what changed everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It started on a Tuesday morning in March, when the rain was hitting Portland's sidewalks like bullets. I was rushing to catch the MAX train downtown, clutching my security badge and a lukewarm cup of coffee from the cart near my apartment. At 28, I had everything mapped out. My job at Cascade Security Solutions was stable, my government clearance was spotless, and I was finally making the kind of money that meant I could stop checking my bank balance before buying groceries. I remember feeling proud that morning. 3 years of government contracting work, specializing in cybersecurity protocols for federal agencies. My supervisor, David Kim, had mentioned a promotion was coming. Department heads were impressed with my work on the new encryption standards. Everything felt solid, permanent, like I was finally building something that couldn't be taken away. But when I swiped my badge at the office entrance, the light flashed red. I tried again, thinking it was a system glitch. Red again. The security guard, Tony, who usually waved me through with a grin, avoided my eyes and picked up his phone. Within 10 minutes, David appeared with 2 men in dark suits. My stomach dropped before they even spoke. FBI credentials gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Agent Thompson, tall and gray-haired, introduced himself with the kind of professional coldness that meant my life was about to change forever. "Miss Reynolds, we need to speak with you about some irregularities in your background investigation." The conference room smelled like stale coffee and fear. They spread documents across the table like a dealer shuffling cards, each paper more devastating than the last. Bank records showing deposits I'd never made. Email printouts with my name attached to messages I'd never sent. Phone logs connecting me to numbers I'd never dialed. "These transfers appear to be connected to foreign accounts," Agent Thompson said, tapping a highlighted section. "Can you explain why you've been receiving payments from overseas?" I stared at the papers, my hands shaking slightly as I picked up each sheet. The bank account was mine, that was true. But the deposits were complete fiction. Someone had created an elaborate digital trail that painted me as exactly the kind of security risk that would destroy a clearance permanently. "I've never seen these transactions," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Someone has falsified these records." Agent Martinez, younger and seemingly more sympathetic, leaned forward. "Miss Reynolds, we understand this might be overwhelming. But we've also received reports from family members expressing concern about your recent behavior and associations." The room went silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. "Family members? Your parents contacted our office 3 weeks ago. They provided additional documentation regarding suspicious activities and expressed concerns about your loyalty to the country." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not strangers, not enemies. My own parents had orchestrated this destruction. They had called the FBI and handed over fabricated evidence designed to ruin me. "I need to make a phone call," I said. "That won't be necessary right now," Agent Thompson replied. "We need you to surrender your security credentials and any classified materials in your possession. Your clearance is being immediately suspended pending investigation." David Kim appeared in the doorway, his face pale. He couldn't meet my eyes as he asked for my badge, my laptop, and my access cards. 3 years of impeccable service erased in minutes because someone who shared my DNA had decided to destroy me. The walk out of that building felt endless. Every colleague I passed seemed to know what was happening. Conversations stopped. Eyes followed me. By afternoon, word would spread through the entire federal contracting community. My career wouldn't just be over at Cascade Security Solutions. It would be over everywhere. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, staring at my phone. Part of me wanted to call my parents immediately, to scream and demand explanations. But something deeper told me to wait, to think, to understand what I was really dealing with before I made any moves. Instead, I drove to the apartment I'd been so proud to afford and began researching. If someone had fabricated evidence convincing enough to fool the FBI, they had done their homework. The bank records were sophisticated forgeries. The email headers looked authentic. Even the phone logs had been doctored with professional precision. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Someone had spent months crafting this destruction. By evening, I had a clearer picture. The overseas account connections were to a consulting firm that had been under federal investigation for money laundering. Whoever created this evidence had tied me to people who were already on the FBI's radar. It was strategic, calculated, and devastatingly effective. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Dinner Sunday? Dad's grilling salmon." I stared at that message for a long time. The casual tone, the complete absence of concern about what they'd just done to my life. They expected me to show up and pretend nothing had happened. They expected me to sit at their table and make small talk, while my entire future burned around us. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and began documenting everything I could remember about the past few months. Had there been signs? Conversations that seemed strange at the time? Questions my parents had asked that felt oddly specific? And then I remembered Thanksgiving dinner. My father had asked detailed questions about my security protocols at work. Which systems I accessed, which databases I had clearance for, what kind of information I handled daily. At the time, it had seemed like parental interest in my career. Now it felt like reconnaissance. My mother had been equally curious about my finances, how much I was making, what I was saving, whether I had any investment accounts. She'd even asked about foreign currency, claiming she was thinking about investing in international markets. I'd found it strange then, but I'd answered her questions because she was my mother. They had been gathering information for months, building their case against me, with details I had willingly provided. The realization was suffocating. Every family dinner, every casual conversation, every moment of trust had been weaponized against me. They had smiled at me across the dinner table while planning my professional destruction. My phone rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then played the message. "Honey, you missed dinner Sunday. Dad and I are worried. Call us back." Worried? They were worried about me missing dinner while they had spent the morning destroying my security clearance with fabricated evidence. I called David Kim instead. He answered on the first ring, his voice tense. "Cass, I'm so sorry, I had no choice." "I know," I said, "but I need you to tell me exactly what the agents said. Every detail you can remember." David hesitated. "They said the investigation was ongoing, that the evidence was substantial. They mentioned your parents had been cooperative witnesses." Cooperative witnesses. The phrase echoed in my mind long after I hung up. My parents hadn't just provided false evidence. They had actively participated in an FBI investigation designed to destroy their own daughter. I spent the next 3 days in my apartment, surviving on delivery food and determination. I researched federal investigation procedures, security clearance appeals processes, and legal remedies for false accusations. The system was designed to protect against exactly this kind of sabotage, but it was also designed to err on the side of caution. Even if I could prove the evidence was fabricated, the damage to my reputation would be permanent. No government contractor would hire someone who had been under FBI investigation for potential treason, regardless of the outcome. On Thursday morning, my phone rang again. This time, it was my brother Marcus, the golden child who had become a successful attorney in Seattle. His voice carried the practiced concern of someone delivering bad news. "Cass, Mom and Dad are really upset. They say you won't return their calls. Did they tell you what they did to me?" A pause.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"They mentioned you were having some work troubles. Look, whatever's going on, family comes first. You know that. Family comes first. The irony was almost amusing. Marcus, they called the FBI and provided false evidence to destroy my security clearance. They fabricated bank records and emails to make me look like a foreign agent. Another pause, longer this time. That's a serious accusation, Cass. Are you sure you're thinking clearly right now? The tone shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Marcus was already choosing sides, and it wasn't mine. In his mind, his successful parents who lived in the West Hills and attended charity galas couldn't possibly be capable of something so calculated and cruel. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, I said, and hung up. That afternoon, I received an email from my landlord. My parents had called to express concerns about my mental state. They had suggested he keep an eye on me, mentioned that I might be struggling financially due to some work problems. They had painted themselves as worried parents trying to help their troubled daughter. Even in destruction, they were crafting a narrative that made them the heroes. I walked to Morrison Bridge Coffee House that evening, needing to be around people who didn't know my story. The barista, a college student named Jake, made small talk about the weather while I ordered a simple black coffee. For 10 minutes, I felt normal again. But when I opened my laptop to check job listings, reality crashed back. Every federal contracting position required an active security clearance. Every cybersecurity role in the private sector would run background checks that would uncover the FBI investigation. My entire skill set had been rendered worthless by people who were supposed to love me. I closed the laptop and stared out the window at the Willamette River. The water moved steadily downstream, indifferent to the chaos and human lives happening on its banks. There was something calming about its persistence, its refusal to be stopped by obstacles. That's when I decided I wouldn't be stopped either. I pulled out my phone and called the one person I knew would tell me the truth. Zoe Brennan had been my best friend since college, and she'd never liked my parents. She'd always said there was something calculating about the way they treated me compared to Marcus. They did what? Zoe's voice cracked with disbelief when I explained the situation. I know it sounds impossible. No, it doesn't. Cass, I've been watching them undermine you for years. Remember when you got the scholarship to study abroad, and your dad suddenly had that heart scare that turned out to be nothing? Remember when you got accepted to MIT for graduate school, and your mom got diagnosed with that mysterious illness that disappeared the day after you turned down the program? I had forgotten about those incidents, or maybe I had chosen to forget. It was easier to believe in concerned parents than manipulative ones. They've been sabotaging you your whole life, Zoe continued. This is just the first time they did it so obviously that you couldn't ignore it. After I hung up with Zoe, I sat in that coffee shop until closing time, piecing together a lifetime of subtle sabotage. The job interviews that my parents had somehow known about before I'd told them, followed by mysterious phone calls to those companies expressing concerns about my character. The relationships that had ended after my parents had gotten involved, claiming they were looking out for my best interests. The opportunities that had vanished just as I was about to seize them. They had been controlling my life for years, ensuring I never became successful enough to be independent, never confident enough to question their motives. But this time, they had overplayed their hand. This time, they had created evidence that could be analyzed, investigated, and potentially traced back to its source. I walked home through the quiet Portland streets, rain beginning to fall again. For the first time in days, I felt something other than despair. I felt anger, clean and focused and useful. They thought they had destroyed me. They thought I would come crawling back to them, desperate and defeated, willing to accept their help on their terms. They were wrong. I was going to find out exactly how they had fabricated that evidence. I was going to trace every forged document back to its source. And I was going to make sure the FBI knew they had been manipulated by people who were willing to destroy their own daughter's life, for reasons I was only beginning to understand. The rain picked up as I reached my apartment building. I looked up at my window on the 3rd floor, then at the mailbox, where a letter from Aunt Lillian's estate attorney had been sitting unopened for 2 weeks. I had been too overwhelmed to deal with probate paperwork, but now something told me it was time. I climbed the stairs with purpose for the first time since this nightmare began. Whatever was in that letter, whatever Aunt Lillian had left me, it was about to become part of my fight back. I unlocked my door and reached for the envelope, not knowing that inside was a key to the Pioneer Federal Building and documents that would turn my parents, victory into their ultimate defeat. But that revelation was still hours away. First, I had evidence to gather and a case to build. My parents had taught me to be thorough, methodical, and patient. They were about to learn how well I had absorbed those lessons. The envelope from Aunt Lillian's estate attorney felt heavier than it should have as I tore it open that night. Inside was a single key attached to a brass tag marked PFB 1205, and a letter written in Lillian's familiar cursive handwriting. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind she always used for important correspondence. "My dearest Cassandra," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably facing the worst crisis of your life. Your parents have a talent for timing their cruelest moments when you're already vulnerable. I know this because they did the same thing to me 40 years ago." I sat down hard on my couch, the key cold in my palm. Aunt Lillian had never mentioned any conflict with my parents. In fact, she'd barely been present at family gatherings for the past decade, claiming health issues or travel commitments. I'd always assumed she was simply the eccentric aunt who preferred solitude to family drama. The letter continued. "What I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about your family and about me. The key in your hand opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank on Morrison Street, Box 1205. Inside you'll find documents that prove your parents have been systematically destroying opportunities for both of us for decades. But, more importantly, you'll find the deed to the Pioneer Federal Building downtown." My hands started shaking. The Pioneer Federal Building was a massive structure in the heart of Portland's business district. It housed multiple federal agencies, including the FBI field office where Agent Thompson worked. It was worth millions, maybe tens of millions. I bought that building in 1987 using money I earned from patents they tried to steal from me. Your father, my dear brother, attempted to claim credit for my biotechnology research when I was just starting my career. He nearly succeeded, but I had documentation they didn't know about. I sold those patents, invested wisely, and bought the very building where federal agents work, including the ones who investigate security clearances. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. If this letter was true, then the FBI agents who had destroyed my career based on my parents' lies were paying rent to me through their government lease agreements. I've been waiting for the right moment to tell you all of this, but your parents made sure that moment never came. They monitored my communications with you, intercepted my letters, and gradually isolated me from your life. They were afraid I would tell you the truth about what they're capable of. I remembered now all the times I'd tried to call Aunt Lillian directly and been told she was unavailable or unwell. My parents had always served as intermediaries, claiming they didn't want me to worry her with my problems. They had positioned themselves as protective gatekeepers, while actually preventing any genuine relationship from forming. The building generates approximately $200,000 monthly in rental income, all of which has been accumulating in an account managed by Patterson and Associates. Patricia Vance is the attorney handling my affairs, and she has been instructed to transfer everything to you immediately upon my death. She's also been instructed to help you investigate how your parents have been sabotaging your life. I set the letter down and stared at the key. In one night, I had gone from unemployed and unemployable to the owner of a federal building worth millions. But more than that, I had proof that my parents' behavior followed a decades-long pattern of calculated cruelty. The next morning, I walked to First National Bank with the key clutched tightly in my jacket pocket. The rain had stopped, but Portland's gray sky matched my mood perfectly. I felt like I was walking toward either salvation or deeper catastrophe, and I wouldn't know which until I opened that safety deposit box. The bank manager, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Chen, led me down to the vault, after verifying my identification and Aunt Lillian's death certificate. Box 1205 was larger than I'd expected, deep enough to hold several folders worth of documents. Inside, I found exactly what Lillian had promised. The deed to the Pioneer Federal Building, signed over to me as of her death date 3 weeks earlier. Financial statements showing years of rental income accumulating in an account I now controlled. And a thick folder labeled Robert and Diana Reynolds, Documentation of Interference. I opened that folder with trembling hands and found a timeline that made me sick to my stomach. Lillian had been documenting my parents' sabotage efforts for over a decade. She had copies of phone calls they'd made to potential employers, warning them that I was emotionally unstable or unreliable under pressure. She had email printouts where my mother had contacted universities to withdraw applications I'd submitted, claiming I was no longer interested. She even had recorded conversations where my father had impersonated references to give negative reviews of my work performance. But the most devastating evidence was a series of bank records showing payments my parents had made to various people over the years. $1,000 to a graduate school admissions officer the week my application was mysteriously rejected despite perfect qualifications. $500 to a hiring manager at a technology firm where I'd been told the position was eliminated just before my final interview. Hundreds of smaller payments to people who had somehow influenced decisions that affected my life. They hadn't just been undermining me casually or emotionally. They had been paying people to destroy my opportunities systematically. At the bottom of the folder was a handwritten note from Lillian. I tried to help you indirectly over the years by creating other opportunities, but they always found out and blocked those too. The building is my gift to you, but it's also my weapon against them. The FBI agents who destroyed your career are now your tenants. Use that information wisely. I closed the safety deposit box and walked out of the bank in a daze. I owned a federal building. I was landlord to the very agents who had accused me of being a security risk. The monthly rental income was more money than I'd made in my entire career at Cascade Security Solutions. But instead of feeling triumphant, I felt exhausted. The scope of my parents' betrayal was overwhelming. This wasn't just about the FBI investigation or my destroyed security clearance. This was about a lifetime of manipulation so extensive that I couldn't even identify all the ways it had shaped my choices. I walked to Morrison Bridge Coffee House and ordered the same black coffee I'd been drinking all week. Jake, the barista, was working again, and he gave me a concerned look. "Rough week?" he asked, handing me the cup. "You could say that," I replied, then found my usual table by the window. I pulled out my phone and called Patricia Vance, the attorney Lillian had mentioned. Her secretary put me through immediately. "Miss Reynolds." Patricia's voice was warm but professional. "I've been expecting your call. Lillian told me you'd probably need legal assistance once you discovered what your parents had been doing." She knew about the FBI investigation? She knew it was coming. Your parents contacted her 3 months ago, trying to get information about your finances for what they claimed was a family trust they were establishing. She realized they were gathering ammunition for something bigger. Quote, "I felt another wave of betrayal wash over me. Even in their final attack, they had tried to use Lillian as an unwitting accomplice." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we document everything and decide how you want to proceed. The building ownership is straightforward. All the paperwork is already filed. You're immediately entitled to all accumulated rental income, which, as of yesterday, totaled just over $1 million. I nearly dropped the phone. $1 million? Lillian was very good with investments. The rental income has been compounding for years while she lived modestly off her other assets. She wanted you to have real financial independence, not just property. After I hung up with Patricia, I sat in that coffee shop for hours, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. I had gone from desperate and unemployable to financially independent overnight. But the money felt secondary to the validation of knowing that Aunt Lillian had seen what was happening to me and had been fighting it in her own way. I thought about all the family gatherings where Lillian had seemed distant or uninterested. Now I understood she had been watching, documenting, building a case against her own brother and sister-in-law. She had sacrificed her relationship with the family to protect evidence that would eventually save me. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Cassandra, we need to talk. This silent treatment is childish. Come to dinner tonight." I stared at that message for a long time. They still expected me to respond to their summons like an obedient daughter. They had no idea that their victim had just become their landlord. Instead of responding, I called David Kim at Cascade Security Solutions. "Cass," he answered quietly. "I was hoping you'd call. Look, I've been thinking about what happened, and some things aren't adding up." "What kind of things?" "The timing, mostly. The FBI had been building this case against you for weeks, but none of us noticed any unusual activity in your work patterns. Usually, when someone's compromised, there are signs: irregular hours, accessing files they don't normally need, behavior changes. You didn't show any of those red flags. Because I wasn't compromised. I'm starting to believe that. And Cass, there's something else. Agent Thompson asked me very specific questions about your family relationships. He wanted to know if your parents had ever expressed concerns about you to coworkers. That seemed strange to me, like he was looking for confirmation of something he'd already been told. So the FBI had been primed to see my parents as credible sources before they ever interviewed them. The investigation had been shaped from the beginning to confirm their narrative rather than discover the truth. David, do you think there's any way to appeal the clearance decision? Honestly? Even if you could prove the evidence was fabricated, the process takes years, and the burden of proof is enormous. Most people just move on to other careers. But I wasn't most people anymore. I had resources now, and I had documentation that proved my parents were capable of exactly the kind of elaborate deception the FBI had fallen for. That evening, I walked downtown to see my building for the first time as its owner. The Pioneer Federal Building stood 12 stories high, its Art Deco facade imposing and elegant against the Portland skyline. Federal employees streamed in and out of the main entrance, going about their business in a building I now controlled. I walked around the perimeter, studying every detail. This was where Agent Thompson worked. This was where the decision had been made to destroy my career based on fabricated evidence. And now, through Aunt Lillian's careful planning, I owned the ground they stood on. A security guard at the main entrance nodded politely as I passed. In his eyes, I was just another pedestrian, admiring the architecture. He had no idea he worked for me now. I continued walking until I found a small park across the street where I could sit and observe the building directly. Federal agents, clerks, administrators, and contractors moved in and out like ants in a colony, all of them paying rent, indirectly, to the woman they had branded a security risk. My phone rang. It was Patricia Vance. "Miss Reynolds, I've been reviewing the documentation your aunt left, and I think you should know that your parents aren't finished with their campaign against you." "What do you mean?" "Lillian intercepted communications suggesting they're planning to have you declared mentally incompetent. They've been laying groundwork with family friends and your brother, creating a narrative that you've had a psychological breakdown due to work stress." The pattern was continuing. First they destroyed my career, now they wanted to destroy my legal capacity to fight back. If they succeeded in having me declared incompetent, they could potentially gain control of my inheritance as my closest relatives. How long do we have before they make their move? Based on what Lillian documented, probably within the next few weeks. They'll likely try to have you involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation. Once you're in the system, it becomes much harder to prove you're competent. I felt the familiar coldness spreading through my chest, the same feeling I'd had when Agent Thompson laid out those fabricated documents. My parents weren't just content to ruin my career. They wanted to destroy my ability to fight back entirely. What can we do to stop them? We get ahead of the story. We document your current mental state with independent psychiatric evaluations. We establish that you're making rational decisions and managing your affairs competently. And we prepare to expose their pattern of behavior before they can implement their next attack. After I hung up, I remained in that park until the federal building's lights began turning off floor by floor. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. I was sitting across from a building I owned, planning a defense against parents who had already succeeded in turning federal law enforcement against me. But this time was different. This time I had resources, documentation, and legal representation. This time I wasn't alone. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Professor James Norton's number. He had been my favorite instructor in college, and he'd always told students to contact him if they ever needed professional references. I'd never taken him up on that offer, but now seemed like the right time. "Cassandra!" Professor Norton's voice was genuinely pleased. "How wonderful to hear from you. How's the government contracting work going?" I explained the situation carefully, focusing on the facts rather than the emotional impact. Professor Norton listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "This is remarkably sophisticated for a personal vendetta," he said when I finished. "The level of planning and execution suggests they've done something like this before. My aunt documented other instances going back decades. Then you're dealing with people who have refined their methods over time. The good news is that patterns are evidence. The bad news is that they're probably already planning their next move while you're still processing the last one." Professor Norton agreed to provide a character reference and connect me with other professionals who could vouch for my competence and stability. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of a real defense strategy. I walked home through downtown Portland as the city settled into evening rhythms. The street lights reflected off wet pavement, and the sound of my footsteps echoed between buildings. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just surviving. Back in my apartment, I spread Aunt Lillian's documents across my kitchen table and began organizing them chronologically. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Every major opportunity in my life had been followed by mysterious problems that prevented me from capitalizing on it. Every relationship that had shown promise had been poisoned by information that somehow reached the wrong people at the wrong time. They had been puppeteers pulling strings I couldn't see, shaping my life to keep me dependent and controllable. The FBI investigation was just the latest, most extreme example of tactics they'd been using for years. But now I could see the strings. And I owned the building where federal agents made decisions about security clearances. I looked at the key to the safety deposit box, still sitting on my counter where I'd left it that morning. Such a small thing to change everything so completely. Tomorrow, I would start building my counterattack. Tonight, I would sleep in my own apartment, owned by someone who finally understood the game that had been played against her for years. The rain started falling again outside my window, steady and persistent like Portland nights always were. But for the first time in weeks, the sound felt comforting instead of oppressive. I was no longer the victim in this story. I was the owner of the building where my accusers worked, and I was finally ready to use that advantage. The call came at 6 a.m, jarring me awake with its persistence. Patricia Vance's name glowed on my phone screen, and something about the early hour told me this wasn't routine legal business. "Cassandra, I need you to get dressed and meet me at my office immediately." Patricia's voice was tight with urgency. "Your parents filed emergency commitment papers yesterday evening. There's a court hearing scheduled for 9 this morning." I sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hour. "Commitment papers? They're claiming you've had a psychotic break triggered by job loss and are making delusional claims about owning federal property. They've submitted statements from your brother and several family friends expressing concern for your mental stability." The calculated precision of it took my breath away. While I'd been organizing documents and building a defense strategy, they had been orchestrating the next phase of their attack. They weren't just trying to discredit me anymore. They were trying to have me locked away. "How long do we have before the hearing?" "Less than 3 hours. Emergency commitment hearings move fast because they're designed to protect people who are genuinely in crisis. The problem is that the system assumes family members are acting in good faith." I was already pulling clothes from my closet, my mind racing through the implications. If they succeeded in having me committed, even temporarily, it would provide retroactive justification for everything they'd told the FBI. It would paint me as someone whose mental state had been deteriorating for months, making their concerns seem prescient rather than fabricated. What do we need to prove that I'm competent? We need to demonstrate that you're making rational decisions, managing your affairs responsibly, and that your claims about the building ownership are factual rather than delusional. Fortunately, we have documentation for all of that. I arrived at Patricia's office 45 minutes later, my hair still damp from the world's fastest shower. The building was mostly empty at this hour, but Patricia had clearly been there for hours. Her conference table was covered with documents, legal briefs, and what looked like architectural plans of the Pioneer Federal Building. "I've pulled together everything we need," she said, pouring coffee from a machine that looked like it had been working overtime. building deeds, rental agreements, bank statements showing the accumulated income, and independent verification of your aunt's estate transfer. I've also contacted the bank manager who helped you access the safety deposit box yesterday. She's willing to testify that you appeared completely rational and composed during the transaction. I reviewed the documents while Patricia explained the hearing process. The judge would evaluate whether there was probable cause to believe I posed a danger to myself or others due to mental illness. My parents would present their case first, supported by their witnesses and documentation of my alleged psychological decline. The key, Patricia explained, is not just to prove that you're mentally competent, but to demonstrate that their petition is being made in bad faith. If we can show a pattern of manipulation and false accusations, the judge might see this as abuse of the legal system rather than genuine concern. At 8:30, we walked to the courthouse together. The Portland morning was crisp and clear, one of those rare days when the city's beauty was undeniable, despite the circumstances. I wondered if this would be the last morning I spent as a free person, or if it would be the day I finally broke free from my parents' control entirely. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. My parents sat in the front row with Marcus, all dressed in conservative business attire that projected responsibility and concern. They had brought 2 family friends as witnesses, people I recognized from years of holiday gatherings and community events. They looked up when I entered with Patricia, and I saw something flicker across my mother's face. Surprise, maybe, that I looked composed and professionally dressed, instead of disheveled and unhinged. For just a moment, her carefully constructed mask of maternal worry slipped, and I saw the calculation underneath. Judge Morrison was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of family dysfunction. She reviewed the emergency petition while we waited, occasionally glancing up at the assembled parties. This hearing will determine whether there is probable cause to believe that Miss Cassandra Reynolds poses a substantial likelihood of serious harm to herself or others as a result of mental illness. Judge Morrison began. The petitioners may present their case first. My father stood up, his voice carrying the measured tone he used for important business presentations. Your Honor, my wife and I are deeply concerned about our daughter's mental state following her recent job loss. She has become increasingly paranoid, making elaborate claims about conspiracies against her, and believing she owns property that she clearly cannot afford. He presented a timeline of my supposed psychological decline, supported by statements from Marcus and the family friends. According to their narrative, I had been showing signs of instability for months before being fired from my job for suspicious behavior. The job loss had triggered a complete break from reality, leading me to fabricate stories about inheritance and property ownership. She claims to own the Pioneer Federal Building, my mother added, her voice trembling with practiced concern. This is a delusion that developed after she was terminated for security violations. We're afraid she might try to gain unauthorized access to federal property or make threats against the agents who investigated her. The family friends nodded along, describing conversations where I had allegedly made concerning statements about government surveillance and persecution. Their testimony was carefully crafted to sound credible without being too specific, hitting all the right notes to suggest someone losing touch with reality. Marcus provided the most damaging testimony, speaking as both a family member and a legal professional. My sister has always been prone to emotional instability, but this is unprecedented. She's making increasingly elaborate claims and refusing to accept help from people who care about her. As an attorney, I believe she needs immediate psychiatric intervention before she does something that could result in federal charges. When they finished presenting their case, Judge Morrison turned to Patricia and me. Ms. Vance, does your client wish to respond to these allegations? Patricia stood and placed the first document in front of the judge. Your Honor, these allegations are not only false but represent a pattern of abuse that has been ongoing for decades. Ms. Reynolds is not mentally ill. She is the victim of systematic sabotage by family members who have been undermining her opportunities and relationships for years. She walked through the evidence methodically. The deed to the Pioneer Federal Building, properly filed and recorded. Bank statements showing the accumulated rental income that had been transferred to my account. Documentation from Lillian's estate attorney confirming the legitimate inheritance. Furthermore, Patricia continued, we have evidence that the petitioners have been engaged in fraudulent activities designed to destroy Miss Reynolds' career and reputation. She presented copies of the fabricated documents that had been provided to the FBI, along with Aunt Lillian's documentation of payments made to influence hiring decisions and academic admissions. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as Patricia laid out the evidence. My parents' carefully constructed narrative began to crumble under the weight of documentation they hadn't known existed. Judge Morrison examined each document carefully, occasionally asking Patricia to clarify details about the estate transfer or building ownership. When she was satisfied with the authenticity of the paperwork, she looked directly at me. Miss Reynolds, I'd like to hear from you directly. Can you explain your current living situation and how you're managing your affairs? I stood up, my voice steady, despite the surreal nature of having to prove my sanity to a judge. I described my current apartment, my daily routines, my plans for managing the building ownership responsibly. I explained how I'd discovered the inheritance and worked with legitimate attorneys and financial professionals to understand my new circumstances. Your Honor, I understand that my situation is unusual. Inheriting valuable property is life-changing for anyone, but I've been working with qualified professionals to manage these new responsibilities appropriately. I'm not delusional or unstable. I'm someone who has finally learned the truth about how my family has been manipulating my life. Judge Morrison asked several follow-up questions, testing my understanding of the financial and legal aspects of the inheritance. I answered each one clearly and accurately, demonstrating that I had a rational grasp of my situation. Then she turned to the bank manager Patricia had brought as a witness. Mrs. Chen testified that I had appeared completely normal and competent when accessing the safety deposit box, showing no signs of confusion or mental distress. In fact, Mrs. Chen added, Miss Reynolds asked very appropriate questions about the documentation and seemed to understand the significance of what she was discovering. Her behavior was that of someone processing important information, not someone experiencing delusions. The final witness was Professor Norton, who testified about my academic performance and professional character. His testimony painted a picture of someone who had consistently demonstrated good judgment and emotional stability throughout college and early career years. After all testimony was completed, Judge Morrison took a brief recess to review the evidence. When she returned, her expression was serious but not sympathetic to my parents' position. The evidence presented clearly demonstrates that Miss Reynolds is not mentally ill and does not pose a danger to herself or others. Quote, Judge Morrison stated. The property ownership claims that petitioners characterized as delusional have been verified through legitimate legal documentation. The inheritance in question is real and has been properly transferred through established legal procedures. She paused and looked directly at my parents. More concerning to this court is evidence suggesting that the petitioners may have been engaged in fraudulent activities designed to damage Miss Reynolds' reputation and career prospects. The documentation presented by the defense raises serious questions about the good faith nature of this commitment petition. My parents' faces had gone pale. Marcus was staring at the documents on Patricia's table, like he couldn't quite process what had just happened. The petition for emergency commitment is denied, Judge Morrison continued. Furthermore, this court is referring the matter to the district attorney's office for possible investigation into fraudulent use of the legal system and potential criminal charges related to the fabrication of evidence presented to federal investigators. The gavel's sound echoed through the small courtroom like a gunshot. In less than 2 hours, my parents' final attack had not only failed but had exposed them to serious legal consequences. As we filed out of the courtroom, my mother tried to approach me. Cassandra, please, you have to understand we were just trying to help. No, I said quietly, not stopping or turning around. You were trying to destroy me. Again. Outside the courthouse, Patricia and I stood on the steps in the morning sunlight. Federal workers were walking to their jobs in buildings throughout downtown Portland, including my building, where Agent Thompson would spend his day investigating security clearances for people whose lives could be destroyed by fabricated evidence. What happens now? I asked. Now we go on the offensive, Patricia replied. We file complaints with the FBI about the fraudulent evidence they were provided. We pursue civil remedies for the documented sabotage of your career opportunities. And we make sure your parents face consequences for what they've done. That afternoon, I met with a private investigator Patricia recommended, a former federal agent named Rebecca Torres, who specialized in white-collar fraud cases. Rebecca reviewed Aunt Lillian's documentation and the evidence we'd presented in court. "This is one of the most systematic campaigns of personal destruction I've ever seen," Rebecca said. "The level of planning and execution is remarkable. Your parents have been running a decades-long operation to control your life." She explained how we could trace the fabricated evidence back to its sources, potentially identifying who had helped create the false bank records and email communications. More importantly, we could establish a timeline that would demonstrate premeditation and coordination. "The FBI doesn't like being manipulated," Rebecca added. "When Agent Thompson realizes he was used as a weapon in a family vendetta, he's going to be very interested in making sure your parents face appropriate consequences." Over the next few days, I established new routines that reflected my changed circumstances. I met with property management companies to handle the day-to-day operations of the federal building. I consulted with financial advisors about managing the rental income responsibly. I began the process of having my security clearance case reviewed based on new evidence of fraudulent accusations. But the most significant change was psychological. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't anticipating sabotage or expecting opportunities to disappear mysteriously. I was making plans based on my own goals rather than trying to navigate around obstacles my parents had created. Zoe came to visit that weekend, and we sat in my apartment going through all of Aunt Lillian's documentation together. The scope of what my parents had done was still overwhelming, but it was also liberating to finally understand why so many things in my life had gone wrong for inexplicable reasons. "I keep thinking about all the times I blamed myself," I told Zoe. "All the opportunities I thought I'd ruined or relationships I thought I'd destroyed through my own failures." "They wanted you to blame yourself," Zoe replied. "That's how this kind of manipulation works. If you don't understand why bad things keep happening, you start to assume you're the problem." That evening, I walked downtown to look at my building again. The evening shift of federal employees was heading home while security guards took their positions for the night. The Pioneer Federal Building stood solid and imposing against the Portland skyline, its Art Deco details catching the last light of sunset. I thought about Aunt Lillian walking these same streets 40 years ago, making the decision to buy this building as both an investment and a statement. She had turned my parents' betrayal into her own form of justice, creating a legacy that would eventually protect me from their final attack. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Miss Reynolds, this is Agent Thompson. I need to speak with you about new information regarding your case. When would be convenient?" I smiled as I typed my response. "My schedule is flexible now. I work from home since I own the building where your office is located." The next phase of this story was about to begin, but for the first time, I would be writing it instead of having it written for me. I looked up at the 12th floor where the FBI field office occupied several floors of my building. Tomorrow, Agent Thompson would learn that the woman he'd accused of being a security risk was actually his landlord, and that the evidence he'd used to destroy her career had been fabricated by people who were now under criminal investigation. The rain started to fall again, gentle and steady, like Portland evenings always were. But instead of seeking shelter, I stood there and let it wash over me, feeling clean and free for the first time in years. I owned this building. I owned my own story now. And tomorrow, everyone would know exactly what that meant. Agent Thompson's office was on the 9th floor of my building, accessible through the federal employee elevator that required special clearance. The irony wasn't lost on me as I waited in the lobby, watching him emerge from the same security checkpoint that had once symbolized everything I'd lost. He looked older than I remembered, his gray hair more pronounced and his face carrying the weight of someone who'd realized he'd made a significant mistake. When he approached, his usual federal agent composure was notably absent. "Miss Reynolds," he said, extending his hand with careful formality, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me. We walked to a coffee shop 3 blocks away, neutral territory that wouldn't carry the psychological weight of either the federal building or a legal office. Agent Thompson ordered black coffee and stared at it for several moments before speaking. "I need to start by apologizing," he said finally. "The evidence your parents provided appeared comprehensive and credible. We had no reason to suspect it had been fabricated, especially coming from family members expressing genuine concern." I watched him struggle with the admission. Federal agents weren't accustomed to acknowledging they'd been manipulated, particularly not by civilian family members with no apparent expertise in intelligence operations. "The sophistication of the forgeries was remarkable," he continued. "Bank records that matched formatting standards exactly, email headers that passed our technical analysis, phone records that correlated with known security risks we were already monitoring. Someone invested significant time and money into making this deception believable. My parents have been perfecting these techniques for decades," I replied. "What you saw was the culmination of years of practice manipulating institutions and individuals." Agent Thompson pulled out a tablet and showed me forensic analysis results from the FBI's technical division. "We've traced the fabricated bank records to a document creation service in Seattle. The email forgeries were created using sophisticated spoofing software. The phone records were generated by manipulating legitimate call logs from a telecommunications insider. The scope of resources my parents had accessed was staggering. They hadn't just created crude forgeries. They had assembled a network of technical specialists capable of fooling federal investigators. We're building a case against everyone involved in this conspiracy," Agent Thompson said. "But I wanted you to know that your security clearance suspension is being reversed immediately. We're also recommending you for the highest level of clearance available, given what you've endured and how you've handled this situation." The restoration of my clearance felt anticlimactic after everything that had happened. 3 weeks ago, it would have meant everything to me. Now it was simply one piece of a much larger puzzle falling back into place. "There's something else," Agent Thompson continued. "During our investigation into the fabricated evidence, we discovered that your parents weren't acting alone. They're part of a larger network that specializes in destroying people's careers and reputations for clients willing to pay premium rates." My coffee grew cold as he explained what they'd uncovered. My parents had been running what amounted to a professional destruction service, using the techniques they'd perfected on me to target other people's children, business competitors, and personal enemies. "The sophistication we saw in your case wasn't just about hurting you specifically," Agent Thompson said. "It was about testing and refining methods they were selling to other clients. You were both a victim and a proof of concept for their broader criminal enterprise." The realization hit me like physical pain. I hadn't just been the target of family cruelty. I had been the test subject for a business model built on systematic destruction of innocent people's lives. "How many others?" I asked. "We've identified at least 15 cases over the past 5 years, where similar tactics were used against different targets, young professionals who had their careers destroyed by fabricated security violations, business executives who lost everything due to manufactured financial scandals, people whose lives were demolished by families, competitors, or enemies who paid for professional-grade character assassination." I thought about all those people living with the same confusion and self-doubt I'd experienced. People who blamed themselves for failures that were actually carefully orchestrated attacks. People who never discovered the truth about what had been done to them. "We want your help building the case," Agent Thompson said. "Your aunt's documentation provides the historical context we need to demonstrate the long-term pattern. Your testimony about their methods would be invaluable in prosecuting not just your parents, but the entire network they've been working with." After meeting with Agent Thompson, I drove to Patricia's office to discuss the implications of becoming a federal witness. The legal landscape was shifting rapidly, transforming me from victim to key evidence in what could become a major federal prosecution. "This changes everything," Patricia explained. "If you testify in a federal case against a criminal conspiracy, you'll have protection under witness security provisions. But you'll also be permanently marking yourself as someone who brought down a sophisticated criminal organization." The decision felt weighty, but not difficult. Too many people had suffered the same kind of systematic destruction I'd experienced. If my testimony could prevent others from enduring what I'd been through, the choice was clear. That evening, Rebecca Torres called with an update on her investigation into the technical aspects of the evidence fabrication. We've identified the Seattle document service your parents used. The owner is cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges. She's provided client lists, payment records, and examples of work done for dozens of different destruction campaigns. The scope of the criminal network was expanding with each new discovery. What had started as a family betrayal had revealed a professional industry built around ruining innocent people's lives. There's something else you should know, Rebecca continued. Your parents tried to destroy the evidence of their other clients when they learned about the federal investigation. But your Aunt Lillian had been documenting more than just their attacks on you. She had been tracking their entire operation for years. Aunt Lillian's foresight continued to amaze me. She hadn't just protected me from my parents' final attack. She had been building a case against their entire criminal enterprise, gathering evidence that would eventually bring down a network of professional saboteurs. The next morning, I received a call from David Kim at Cascade Security Solutions. The company had learned about the fabricated evidence and wanted to offer me my old position back, along with a promotion and a formal apology for the way they'd handled my termination. We should have investigated more thoroughly before accepting the FBI's conclusions, David said. Your work record with us was exemplary. We made a mistake, and we want to make it right. I thanked David for the offer but declined the position. My circumstances had changed too dramatically to return to my old life. Instead, I proposed a consulting arrangement where I could help Cascade develop better protocols for handling security clearance investigations and protecting employees from false accusations. The consulting work felt meaningful in a way my previous job never had. I was using my experience as a victim of sophisticated manipulation to help others avoid similar traps. Companies were eager to learn about the tactics my parents had used, particularly as federal investigators revealed how widespread such attacks had become. That afternoon, I met with the property management team handling the Pioneer Federal Building. As the owner, I needed to be briefed on tenant relations, lease agreements, and ongoing maintenance projects. The building manager, Carol Wright, had been running operations for 15 years and knew every detail of the property's functioning. I have to say, Miss Reynolds, this is the most unusual ownership transition I've ever handled, Carol said as we toured the mechanical floors. Most real estate investors want to maximize profits immediately. You seem more interested in maintaining the building's reputation and tenant satisfaction. I explained that my approach to ownership was influenced by the unique nature of having federal agencies as tenants. The building's reputation for security and professionalism was more valuable than short-term profit maximization. There's something you should know about the federal lease agreements, Carol continued. They include clauses requiring the building owner to maintain security clearance standards. Since you now own the property, you'll need to undergo additional background screening by the agencies that lease space here. The security clearance requirements for building ownership struck me as particularly ironic. The same federal system that had branded me a security risk based on fabricated evidence now needed to clear me to own the building where security decisions were made. Given recent events, Carol added diplomatically, I imagine that background screening will be more thorough than usual. 2 days later, Agent Thompson called to schedule my formal witness interview. The FBI was coordinating with other federal agencies to build the most comprehensive case possible against my parents' criminal network. We're also working with international law enforcement, he explained. Some of the technical services your parents used were based overseas. This conspiracy crosses multiple jurisdictions and involves violations of several different federal statutes. The witness interview took place in a secure conference room within my own building, a detail that felt symbolically important. I was no longer the accused being questioned about fabricated evidence. I was the key witness helping to unravel a criminal conspiracy that had victimized dozens of innocent people. The federal prosecutor leading the case, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Carter, walked me through the evidence methodically. My parents' operation had generated millions of dollars in revenue over the past decade by destroying people's careers, relationships, and reputations for clients willing to pay for guaranteed results. The technical sophistication of their methods represents a new category of white-collar crime, Prosecutor Carter explained. They weren't just committing fraud. They were operating a sophisticated psychological warfare service disguised as family concern or business competition. During the interview, I learned that Marcus had been cooperating with federal investigators since the commitment hearing. My brother's legal training had helped him recognize the potential criminal liability he faced for participating in the conspiracy, even as an unwitting accomplice. Your brother provided crucial information about the financial structure of your parents' operation, Agent Thompson said. He had access to bank records and business documents that confirmed the scope of their criminal enterprise. The revelation about Marcus was complicated. He had participated in destroying my career and attempting to have me committed, but he had also provided evidence that would help convict the people who had manipulated him into those actions. After the interview, I walked to Morrison Bridge Coffee House, where this nightmare had begun weeks earlier. Jake was working behind the counter, and he greeted me with the same friendly professionalism he'd shown when I was unemployed and desperate. "Haven't seen you in a while," he said, preparing my usual black coffee. "Things looking up?" "You could say that," I replied, not sure how to explain that I now owned a federal building and was testifying in a major criminal case against my own parents. I sat at my old table by the window and opened my laptop to review consulting proposals from 3 different companies. The demand for expertise in recognizing and preventing sophisticated personal attacks had exploded as news of the federal investigation spread through professional networks. My phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. "Saw the news article about the federal investigation. How are you handling all this?" The news article was the first public reporting about the criminal case, though it didn't mention specific victims by name. Reading about my parents' arrest in the Portland Tribune felt surreal, like watching a movie about someone else's life. That evening, Patricia called with an update on the civil lawsuit we were preparing against my parents and their co-conspirators. "We're seeking damages not just for the immediate harm they caused, but for the lifetime of opportunities they destroyed through their systematic sabotage." The civil case would proceed parallel to the federal criminal prosecution, potentially resulting in significant financial compensation for the decades of professional and personal damage I'd suffered. "There's also interest from other victims who want to join a class action lawsuit," Patricia continued. "As this case develops, we're discovering that your parents' methods were used against people across multiple industries and geographic regions." The prospect of leading a class action lawsuit felt daunting but necessary. Too many people had suffered in isolation, blaming themselves for failures that were actually sophisticated attacks orchestrated by professional saboteurs. 2 weeks later, I received official notification that my security clearance had been fully restored with the highest possible rating. The same federal system that had destroyed my career based on fabricated evidence was now certifying me as exceptionally trustworthy, based on how I'd handled the investigation and exposure of the criminal conspiracy. The clearance restoration came with a formal apology from the FBI director and an invitation to participate in developing new protocols for investigating allegations of security violations. My experience as a victim of sophisticated evidence fabrication had given me unique insights into vulnerabilities within the federal security screening process. Standing in my apartment that night, looking out at the Portland skyline with the lights of my federal building visible in the distance, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed. 3 weeks ago, I had been unemployed, unemployable, and facing involuntary commitment. Now I was a building owner, federal witness, security consultant, and key figure in a major criminal prosecution. But the most significant change was psychological. I was no longer someone things happened to. I was someone who made things happen, someone whose experience and knowledge could protect others from suffering similar attacks. My parents had spent decades perfecting methods for destroying people's lives. Now those same methods were being used as evidence to destroy their freedom and dismantle their criminal network. The federal building stood illuminated against the night sky, its Art Deco facade unchanged, despite everything that had transformed within its walls. Tomorrow, federal agents who had once viewed me as a security risk would report to work in a building I owned, pursuing cases against criminals I had helped expose. Justice had arrived not with dramatic flourishes or emotional confrontations, but with methodical documentation, professional investigation, and systematic legal proceedings. It was quiet, thorough, and completely devastating to the people who had thought they could manipulate federal law enforcement with impunity. The rain started falling again, steady and persistent like Portland nights always were. But for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting for the storm to pass. I was the one controlling the weather now. The courtroom was packed on the morning of my parents' sentencing hearing. Federal prosecutors had built an airtight case against Robert and Diana Reynolds, along with 12 co-conspirators who had helped operate their professional destruction network. The evidence filled 3 bankers' boxes and included testimony from 47 victims across 8 states. I sat in the front row with Patricia, watching my parents enter in orange jumpsuits and shackles. They looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by months of pretrial detention and the weight of overwhelming evidence against them. Neither of them looked at me as they took their seats at the defendant's table. Federal Judge Elizabeth Harrison had presided over the entire case with stern efficiency. She had shown little patience for the defendants, attempts to minimize their crimes or shift blame to others. The prosecution had demonstrated that Robert and Diana Reynolds were the architects of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had generated over $4 million in revenue, while destroying dozens of innocent lives. The defendants before this court, Judge Harrison began, operated what can only be described as a weaponized manipulation service. They did not simply commit fraud or identity theft. They systematically destroyed human potential for profit, targeting people's careers, relationships, and mental health with surgical precision. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Carter stood to present the government's sentencing recommendation. She outlined the scope of damage caused by the Reynolds conspiracy, emphasizing how victims had lost not just immediate opportunities, but entire career trajectories and life possibilities. Ms. Cassandra Reynolds, the defendant's own daughter, represents both their most extensively documented victim and their ultimate downfall. Prosecutor Carter said, "The defendants spent decades perfecting their methods on someone they claimed to love, then used those refined techniques to destroy strangers for money. When it was time for victim impact statements, I was the first to speak. I had prepared extensive remarks, but standing at that podium, looking at my parents for the first time since the commitment hearing, I found myself speaking from the heart instead of my notes. Your Honor, for 28 years, I thought I was the problem. Every failed opportunity, every relationship that ended mysteriously, every door that closed just as I was about to walk through it, I blamed myself. I developed anxiety and self-doubt that nearly destroyed my ability to function in the world. I described the psychological impact of their systematic sabotage, the way it had warped my understanding of my own capabilities and worth. But I also talked about the other victims, people who had contacted me after news of the case became public. Jennifer Walsh was fired from her dream job at NASA based on fabricated evidence that she was selling classified information. She spent 3 years unemployable in her field before learning that her ex-husband had paid my parents $50,000 to destroy her career during their divorce proceedings. I continued with other examples. A medical researcher whose grant funding disappeared after competitors hired my parents to create evidence of ethical violations. A small business owner who lost everything when fabricated tax documents triggered an IRS investigation that took 2 years to resolve. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation, I said, looking directly at my parents. These were calculated business decisions made by people who had turned human destruction into a profitable enterprise. They didn't just steal money or property. They stole people's futures, their faith in themselves, and their trust in the world around them. When I finished speaking, 17 other victims took turns at the podium. Each story followed similar patterns: systematic destruction disguised as bad luck or personal failure, sophisticated evidence, fabrication, and years of psychological trauma from not understanding why their lives had fallen apart. The defense attorneys made brief arguments for leniency, citing my parents' age and lack of violent criminal history. But their words felt hollow against the weight of testimony about decades of methodical cruelty. Judge Harrison took a recess before announcing sentences. During the break, Marcus approached me in the courthouse hallway. My brother looked exhausted, aged by months of cooperating with federal investigators and facing the reality of our parents' true nature. I keep thinking about all the times they discouraged me from helping you, he said quietly. All the explanations they gave for why your life was so difficult. I believed them because I wanted to believe them. They were very good at what they did, I replied. That's why their business was so successful. Marcus nodded, tears forming in his eyes. I'm sorry, Cass, for everything. For not seeing it, for not protecting you, for participating in what they did. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison announced sentences that reflected the severity and scope of the crimes. Robert Reynolds received 15 years in federal prison. Diana Reynolds received 12 years. The co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years, depending on their level of involvement. The harm caused by this conspiracy extends far beyond financial damage, Judge Harrison stated. The defendants systematically destroyed human potential and psychological well-being for profit. They weaponized trust and family relationships in service of criminal enterprise. The sentences imposed reflect both the severity of these crimes and the need to deter others who might consider similar conduct. After the hearing, I drove to the Pioneer Federal Building for a meeting with the Tenant Advisory Committee. As the building owner, I had been working with federal agencies to implement new security protocols based on lessons learned from the investigation into fabricated evidence. The advisory committee included representatives from the FBI, DEA, Treasury, and other agencies that leased space in the building. Agent Thompson served as the FBI representative, a role that still felt surreal given our history. Ms. Reynolds, said Treasury Agent Maria Santos, who chaired the committee, we wanted to update you on the implementation of the new evidence verification protocols you recommended. The protocols were based on my experience as a victim of sophisticated forgery. They included additional technical screening for documents provided by family members or personal associates, mandatory cooling-off periods for cases involving family accusations, and enhanced psychological evaluation requirements for targets of security clearance investigations. These protocols have already prevented 2 cases similar to yours, Agent Thompson reported. Fabricated evidence was identified before any adverse action was taken against the targeted individuals. The knowledge that my experience was helping protect others from similar attacks provided a sense of purpose that I had never found in traditional employment. The consulting work had evolved into something approaching a mission, helping institutions recognize and defend against sophisticated manipulation tactics. After the committee meeting, I took the elevator to the 12th floor observation deck that I had recently opened to tenants. The view of Portland stretched out in all directions, the city looking clean and prosperous in the afternoon sunlight. Carol Wright, the building manager, joined me on the deck with the monthly operational reports. Under my ownership, the Pioneer Federal Building had become a model for security and tenant relations, attracting additional government agencies that wanted to lease space in a facility known for its advanced protective protocols. The waiting list for office space has grown to over 24 agencies, Carol reported. Revenue is up 37% from last year, and tenant satisfaction scores are the highest they've been in the building's history. But the financial success felt secondary to the symbolic importance of owning the space where federal security decisions were made. Every day, agents and analysts worked in offices I owned, making determinations about people's trustworthiness and loyalty to the country. That evening, I attended the grand opening of the Reynolds Victim Support Foundation, a nonprofit organization I had established using settlement money from the civil lawsuit against my parents' criminal network. The foundation provided counseling, legal assistance, and financial support to people who had been targeted by professional manipulation campaigns. Zoe had agreed to serve as the foundation's executive director, bringing her background in social work and her deep understanding of psychological trauma to the role. The foundation's offices were located in a renovated warehouse in southeast Portland, deliberately chosen for its welcoming, non-institutional atmosphere. 23 people have already reached out for assistance, Zoe reported during the opening ceremony. Some are victims of the Reynolds conspiracy, but others have been targeted by similar operations we're just beginning to discover. The foundation's existence had revealed that professional destruction services were more widespread than federal investigators had initially realized. My parents' network had been sophisticated and profitable, but it wasn't unique. Similar operations existed in multiple cities, offering character assassination services to clients willing to pay premium rates for guaranteed results. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a trauma specialist who served on the Foundation's advisory board, spoke about the unique psychological challenges faced by victims of systematic manipulation. Traditional therapy approaches often fall short because these victims haven't experienced random trauma or organic relationship failures, Dr. Martinez explained. They've been deliberately targeted by people who understood their vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically. Recovery requires understanding that their struggles were artificially created rather than personally caused. The Foundation's first major client was Jennifer Walsh, the former NASA researcher whose ex-husband had paid my parents to destroy her career. Jennifer had been blacklisted from aerospace work for 3 years before learning the truth about what had happened to her. "I spent those 3 years thinking I was incompetent," Jennifer said during her remarks at the opening ceremony. "I couldn't understand how someone with my qualifications and experience could suddenly become unemployable. The Foundation helped me realize that my professional destruction was intentional, not accidental." With Foundation support, Jennifer had successfully appealed her termination from NASA and returned to her research on Mars exploration technologies. Her case had become a model for how other victims could rebuild their careers once they understood what had actually happened to them. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing outside the Foundation building, looking back at the downtown skyline, where the Pioneer Federal Building stood illuminated against the night sky. The transformation of my life over the past 8 months felt almost impossible to comprehend. I had gone from unemployed and unemployable to building owner and Foundation director, from security risk to security consultant, from victim to advocate for other victims. The journey had been traumatic and difficult, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Miss Reynolds, this is Dr. Emily Chen at Stanford University. We've been following your work on manipulation detection and would like to discuss a research collaboration. Please call when convenient." The academic interest in my experience was gratifying but also overwhelming. Universities, think tanks, and government agencies wanted to study the techniques my parents had used and the methods I had developed for recognizing and countering them. I had become an accidental expert in a field that shouldn't exist, someone whose personal trauma had generated professional knowledge that could help protect others from similar attacks. The next morning brought news that 3 more members of my parents' network had been arrested in Seattle. The investigation continued to expand as federal agents traced financial records and communication patterns that revealed additional co-conspirators and victims. Agent Thompson called with an update on the expanding case. "We've identified victims in 12 states now, and we're coordinating with international law enforcement on related cases in Canada and the United Kingdom. Your parents weren't just running a local operation. They were part of a global network of professional manipulators." The scope of the criminal enterprise continued to astonish me. What had started as a family betrayal had revealed an entire underground industry built around destroying innocent people's lives for profit. "There's something else," Agent Thompson continued. "We've received inquiries from congressional staff about potential hearings on this type of crime. Your testimony could be instrumental in developing new federal legislation to address professional manipulation services." The possibility of testifying before Congress felt daunting but necessary. If my experience could contribute to legal frameworks that prevented others from suffering similar attacks, the public exposure would be worthwhile. That afternoon, I met with Patricia to discuss the congressional testimony request and other developments in the case. The civil lawsuit against my parents, co-conspirators, was proceeding toward additional settlements that could provide funding for victim support services. "You've built something remarkable from an incredibly difficult situation," Patricia observed as we reviewed the Foundation's activities and the building's success. "Most people who endure what you experienced never recover fully. You've turned your recovery into a mission to help others." The comment made me think about Aunt Lillian and the letter she had left me. She had predicted that I would build something meaningful from the destruction my parents had caused. Her investment in the federal building had provided the financial foundation, but the real construction had been psychological and social. That evening, I returned to my apartment and found a package waiting by my door. Inside was a handwritten note from Jennifer Walsh and a small framed photo of the Mars rover she was helping design at NASA. "Thank you for showing me that my failures weren't really failures," Jennifer had written. "This rover will carry a small plaque with the names of everyone who contributed to its development. Your name will be on there because none of this work would have been possible without the Foundation's help." I placed the photo on my kitchen table next to other mementos from people the Foundation had assisted. Each item represented someone who had reclaimed their life after learning the truth about what had been done to them. The following week, I received official notification that my testimony would be requested for congressional hearings on professional manipulation services and their impact on national security. The hearings would examine how sophisticated personal destruction campaigns could be used by foreign adversaries or domestic criminals to undermine American institutions. Preparing for congressional testimony required working with federal prosecutors, academic researchers, and other experts to develop comprehensive recommendations for addressing the growing threat of professional manipulation services. "Your case represents a new category of domestic terrorism," explained Dr. Michael Foster, a Georgetown University professor who specialized in information warfare. "Your parents weren't just committing financial crimes. They were using psychological warfare techniques against American citizens for profit." The characterization as domestic terrorism felt accurate but disturbing. My parents had deployed military-grade manipulation tactics against their own daughter and dozens of other innocent people, treating American citizens as enemy targets in a war they had declared for financial gain. 2 months later, I found myself sitting at a witness table in a packed congressional hearing room, facing a panel of senators and representatives who would determine whether new federal legislation was needed to address professional manipulation services. "Ms. Reynolds," began Senator Patricia Williams, who chaired the Judiciary Committee, "your experience represents both a personal tragedy and a national security concern. Can you explain how the techniques used against you might be employed by hostile foreign actors?" I described how the evidence fabrication methods my parents had used could be scaled up and deployed against government officials, military personnel, or private sector leaders with access to sensitive information. The same techniques that had destroyed my security clearance could be used to compromise people in positions of genuine national importance. "The sophistication of these attacks makes them particularly dangerous," I testified. "Victims often don't realize they've been targeted until years after the damage is done. By that time, their careers are destroyed, their reputations are ruined, and their ability to contribute to society has been eliminated." The testimony lasted 3 hours and covered everything from technical aspects of evidence fabrication to psychological impacts of systematic manipulation. The committee members asked detailed questions about potential legislative remedies and regulatory frameworks that could address the growing threat. 6 months later, the Professional Manipulation Prevention Act became federal law, establishing criminal penalties for systematic personal destruction campaigns and creating victim support programs administered through the Department of Justice. The legislation included provisions I had recommended based on my experience and the Foundation's work with other victims. Federal agencies were required to implement enhanced evidence verification protocols, and victims of professional manipulation campaigns became eligible for specialized counseling and legal assistance. As I walked out of the Capitol building after the bill signing ceremony, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by discovering the truth about my parents. Systematic sabotage. The journey from victim to advocate had been painful but ultimately empowering. My phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. "The Foundation just received its 100th client referral. We're officially too successful for our current space." The Foundation's growth had exceeded all projections, drawing victims of manipulation campaigns from across the country and internationally. The work had evolved beyond supporting individual victims to researching prevention strategies and training institutions to recognize sophisticated attacks. That evening, I stood on the observation deck of the Pioneer Federal Building, looking out over Portland as the city lights began to twinkle in the gathering darkness. The building hummed with activity below as federal agents worked late shifts, pursuing cases and protecting national security interests. Some of those agents were investigating manipulation campaigns similar to the one my parents had operated. Others were implementing the enhanced protocols that had grown out of my experience as a victim of fabricated evidence. All of them were working in a building owned by someone who had been branded a security risk based on lies they now helped prevent. The irony had become a source of strength, rather than bitterness. Every day that federal agents worked in my building was a reminder that truth eventually prevails over deception, that victims can become advocates, and that systematic destruction can be transformed into systematic protection. I pulled out my phone and composed a text to Jennifer Walsh. "Congratulations on the Mars rover launch. Aunt Lillian would be proud to know her investment helped put your name on another planet." The rain started falling again, gentle and steady like Portland nights always were. But I no longer saw the rain as something to endure. It was simply weather, natural and temporary, while the building I owned stood solid and permanent against the sky. I had learned that people could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy them. More importantly, I had learned that survival could become the foundation for something larger and more meaningful than the original destruction had ever threatened to take away. The federal building stood illuminated in the rain, its Art Deco facade unchanged by everything that had transformed within its walls. Tomorrow, federal agents who once might have been manipulated by fabricated evidence would report to work in offices owned by someone whose experience had helped make such manipulation impossible. Justice hadn't come through revenge or dramatic confrontation. It had come through methodical documentation, professional investigation, systematic legal proceedings, and ultimately the transformation of personal trauma into public service. I owned the building where my accusers worked, but more importantly, I had helped create a world where fewer people would face the accusations I had survived. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.